I came back home in the spring of 1948, walking slowly down the dirt road that led to our little town, leaning on a wooden cane, carrying a scar on my leg that would never heal, and another, far deeper one, hidden in my soul, the kind of wound that does not bleed, but keeps you awake at night. For 3 long years, there had been nothing but silence from me. Officially, I had been dead since May of 1945, when my unit disappeared near Bologna. They never knew I had been taken prisoner. They never knew I had survived. The town looked both familiar and foreign. The white fences were more weathered, the elm trees taller, the porches older and more tired than I remembered. But maybe it wasn't the town that had changed. Maybe it was me. I had a battered duffel bag slung over my shoulder, a crumpled letter for Margaret, Maggie, my wife, in my pocket, and a heart that felt heavier than any load I had carried in the war. I didn't know if I was coming back to a home or to a place where I no longer belonged. When I turned the corner onto Maple Street, I saw a boy sitting on the sidewalk in front of the house I had once built with my own hands, playing with a stick, pretending it was a horse. His hair was dark, like his mother's, his face thinner than I imagined it would be, but there was something in the way he leaned forward, in the way he frowned in concentration, that struck me like lightning. It had to be him, my son, my Johnny. I stopped in my tracks, my chest pounding harder than it had even in the worst battles at Monte Cassino. My throat was dry, my voice cracked as I whispered his name out loud, a name I had carried through every night in the camp, every prayer I had dared to make. Johnny. He looked up. For the briefest moment, his eyes stayed on mine, as if some distant memory was trying to wake inside him. And then it vanished. He dropped the stick, turned, and ran as fast as his legs would take him, bursting through the front door and shouting with all the force his small lungs could muster, "Mom, there's a stranger outside!" And I remained there alone, standing on the same street where once I had kissed my wife goodbye and promised I would come back. Only now, to my own son, I was not a father returned from war. I was just a stranger at the gate. If this story is touching you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. I was sent overseas in 1944 with the Fifth Army, part of the long and bloody Italian campaign that took us from the beaches of Naples to the shattered ruins of Monte Cassino and beyond. And even though I carried the flag on my shoulder and the conviction that I was fighting for freedom, in my heart I carried something heavier than tea. A rifle in my hands, the weight of leaving behind my wife Margaret and my 2-year-old boy Johnny, who clung to my coat with his small hands the day I shipped out, his eyes too young to understand why his father had to go, but old enough to feel the fear of being left behind. The battle for Monte Cassino was unlike anything I had ever known or could ever put into words, for the mountain itself seemed determined to resist us, the ancient monastery looming above like a stone sentinel, the ground trembling under the relentless pounding of artillery, the air thick with smoke and cries, and in that chaos, I remember looking at the faces of the men beside me, knowing that many of those faces would never see another sunrise, and yet we pushed on, step by step, driven by orders, by duty, by the sheer stubborn will to survive. We made it through Cassino, but the war was far from over. We marched northward, gaunt, hollow-eyed, more shadows than men, until the spring of 1945, when outside Bologna my luck finally ran out. A piece of shrapnel tore through my leg, throwing me to the ground, and the pain was so sharp and sudden that the world went black. When I came to, I was staring up at the faces of German soldiers, their expressions cold, their boots muddy, and though I thought for sure they would finish me off right there, they did not. Instead, they dragged me away, not as a man but as a prize of war, a broken body they could throw into the cages where they kept the forgotten. Captivity was a kind of death stretched out over endless days, for in that camp near Trieste time itself seemed to rot, every sunrise bleeding into the next until days and nights lost all meaning, and the barbed wire around us became the horizon of our world. We were stripped of our names, reduced to numbers scrawled in ledgers by guards who barely looked at us, and every day the hunger gnawed deeper, every night the silence pressed heavier, until men stopped speaking altogether, as if words themselves had abandoned us. I shared the barrack with Italians, Yugoslavs, even a handful of Frenchmen, and though we spoke different tongues, the sound of prayer was the same in all of them, a whisper to hold on, a plea not to be forgotten, and yet for me, the silence from home was the hardest to endure. I never received a letter, never heard my name called, when the guards tossed out a few scraps of paper that had somehow passed through censors, and I realized after a time that to the world beyond those fences I was already gone. I imagined Margaret opening an envelope with the official seal, reading the sterile words that declared me killed in action, and I imagined her walking to the small yard behind our house and burying my old uniform under the oak tree. A grave for a body that would never come home, and beside her our little boy, too young to understand, holding her hand and learning to live with a father who had become only a memory. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake on the wooden boards of my bunk, staring into the dark, and whisper Johnny's name again and again, as if repeating it might keep him alive in my mind, as if saying it aloud could protect me from forgetting the sound of his laugh or the way his tiny arms felt when I lifted him from his crib. I feared more than death itself that one day I would lose his image entirely, that the war would not only take my body but also erase my memory of my own son, and that fear was the chain that bound me tighter than any barbed wire. When the Americans finally arrived in 1947 and forced open the gates, I stumbled into the light not as a man reborn, but as a shell, carrying with me nothing but the clothes on my back, a ruined leg, and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Freedom was not joy, it was emptiness, the terrifying question of what remained for me in the world I was about to face. And with every step I wondered if Margaret was still alive, if Johnny had grown into a boy who no longer remembered my face, if the house still stood on Maple Street, or if all of it had been swallowed by time and silence. When I finally crossed back onto American soil, the welcome I received was not banners and parades, but cautious stares, for word of my death had already spread years before, and men in town whispered to each other that it was impossible, that no one comes back from the grave, and I saw in their eyes not only surprise, but fear, as if by standing before them I was breaking some natural law. And when I reached the front yard of my own home, I saw under the oak tree a small mound of earth with a cross made of wood, and on it rested my old army jacket, weathered by rain and sun, and I understood then that Margaret had already buried me, that she had done what she had to do to survive, and that I was not returning to the life I had left, but to a life that had learned to go on without me. When I stepped back into the house that I had once built with my own hands, every wall, every beam, every window frame seemed to remind me of the life I had been forced to abandon. And yet I quickly realized that while the structure still stood, the life inside had been reshaped in my absence, and that what had once been mine now belonged to a rhythm of days and nights that no longer included me. Margaret recognized me at once. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no doubt in her tears that ran down her cheeks the moment she saw me standing in the doorway. But her embrace was not the same as before, because it trembled with a kind of fear that only those left behind truly understand. And I felt in her arms both the joy of a prayer answered and the weight of a prayer she had been afraid to see fulfilled. For while she had dreamed of my return, she had also learned to survive without me, and the man she had imagined was not the scarred, hollow-eyed stranger who now stood before her. She confessed to me later, in a quiet moment when Johnny was asleep in the next room, that she had prayed every night for my safety, but also that she had prayed for the strength to live if I did not come back. And when the telegram arrived declaring me dead, she had taken my old uniform jacket, folded it carefully, and buried it under the oak tree in the yard, making a small wooden cross so that she and Johnny would have a place to grieve. And that simple act had allowed her to continue, because without it, the weight of uncertainty would have broken her. My old room was no longer mine. The bed where I had once slept had been taken apart, the space turned into a storeroom, filled with jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and tools for the yard. And I understood in that moment that even the house had adapted to a world without me, that every inch of space had been claimed by necessity, and that my presence was no longer required. I had become a guest in my own home. But the deepest wound was Johnny, who stood in the corner the night I first tried to hold him, his small body rigid with fear, his eyes wide with suspicion. And when I opened my arms, he flinched and turned to his mother, pressing his face against her dress, as though I were some intruder come to steal his world away. He was 7 years old by then, too young to remember the father who had carried him in his arms, too old to accept a stranger suddenly claiming to be that father. And I saw in his eyes not only mistrust, but also the shadow of something worse, indifference. To him, I was simply a man who smelled of hospitals and camps, whose eyes carried a sadness he could not name, and not the father he had once known only as a photograph. I tried to speak to him gently, telling him stories of the world beyond, of Italian hills bathed in sunlight, of vineyards that smelled of ripening grapes, of small towns where bells rang at dusk. But in my heart I knew that those stories were soaked with blood and fear, and that what I wanted to give him was not the truth of war, but the proof that even far away I had thought of him every single day. Still, he would not come closer. He listened in silence, his gaze sliding away, as though my words were a language he did not understand. It was then that I realized the cruelest truth of all, that survival had not guaranteed me a place in my own family. Margaret had learned to live without me. Johnny had grown without me. The house had shifted without me, and the town had accepted my absence. My return was not a restoration, but a disruption, and I felt with every passing day that I had been granted life only to discover that the world had moved on. At meals, I sat at the table, but I was not truly there. My chair had not been waiting for me. It had been replaced by silence, and though I shared bread with them, I could feel that my presence was an intrusion into a pattern that had already been set. I watched as Johnny whispered questions to his mother that he would not dare ask me, and I knew then that trust could not be demanded, that love could not be reclaimed by simply returning home, that I would have to earn it, slowly, painfully, step by step. At night I lay awake, listening to the sound of Margaret's breathing beside me, and I felt the gulf between us. A gulf carved by telegrams, by years of solitude, by the heavy shadow of a wooden cross under the oak tree, and I knew that even in her love there would always be a scar. She had buried me once, and no woman can ever truly dig up the grave of her grief, even if the man she lost walks back through the door. And so I understood that if I was to find my place again, it would not be by reclaiming what had been mine, but by building something new, fragile though it might be, a life not as it was, but as it could be, shaped not by the memory of who I had been, but by the proof of who I still was. The first weeks after my return felt like walking on unsteady ground, as though every step might crack open the fragile surface of the life that Margaret and Johnny had built without me. And I understood quickly that if I wanted to stay, I had to tread carefully, for nothing was waiting for me exactly as I had left it, and if I tried to force myself back into the space I once held, I would only reave them further away. I did not sleep in the house right away, not because Margaret would not have allowed me, but because I could not bring myself to claim what was no longer mine. My old room had been turned into storage, and Johnny could not bear the thought of me sleeping under the same roof. So I made a place for myself in the barn, behind the house, where the air smelled of hay and dust, where the boards creaked with every gust of wind, and though the nights were cold and lonely, I felt strangely more at peace there, because at least in the barn, I was not intruding, not forcing my presence into a home that had learned to live without me. The town, too, watched me with mixed eyes. Some greeted me warmly, clasping my hand and calling me a miracle, the soldier who had returned from the grave, while others whispered behind fences and over coffee that something wasn't right, that no man could vanish for 3 years in Europe and suddenly appear on Maple Street, whole enough to walk, broken enough to frighten even his own boy. To some I was a hero, to others a ghost, and to myself I was not sure what I was at all. To keep from drowning in that uncertainty, I sought work at the carpenter's shop near Main Street. My hands were stiff, my leg throbbed with every movement, but the smell of pine boards and the sound of saws grounded me in a way nothing else could. Wood was honest. If you cut it true, it fit. If you pressed too hard, it broke. There was no deception, no whispers, no telegrams to undo. And in those long hours of sanding, sawing, and joining pieces together, I began to believe, if only faintly, that I could build something new of myself, the way I built a table or a chair. But all of that work, all of that effort, would have meant little if I could not find a way to reach Johnny. And so at night, in the dim light of a lantern, I began to draw. My sketches were simple: horses, birds, a house with smoke curling from the chimney. But each one carried a fragment of the father I had once been, the father I hoped he might still find in me. I left those drawings on the porch, unsure if he would even glance at them. For days there was no response, only silence, only the disappearance of the papers I left behind, and I wondered if he tore them up, if he buried them under his pillow, or if he simply ignored them as the work of a man he could not bring himself to call his own. Then one evening, when I returned to the barn after work, I found a scrap of paper waiting on the table where I had left my lantern. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the letters pressed hard into the page as if written with all the strength a boy could muster. It read, "If you're really my father, tell me what my rabbit's name was." My heart thudded against my chest, because in that question lay everything: his doubt, his hope, his fear, his unwillingness to believe without proof. I smiled for the first time in years, because the answer came to me at once, as clear as if I had never left. His name was Snowball, and I remembered how Johnny had tried to brush him with a toothbrush, only to be bitten for his trouble. The memory of my boy's small fingers reddened by the stubborn little animal forever etched in my mind. I wrote back on the same piece of paper, "Snowball," and I remember he nipped your fingers when you tried to comb him. The next day, another note awaited me. This one was not words, but a drawing, childlike and uneven, of 2 stick figures holding hands. And in that moment, I knew I had crossed some invisible threshold, that my son had given me the smallest piece of trust, fragile as it was, and that from this point forward everything might change. It did not happen all at once. Johnny still kept his distance, still watched me with wary eyes, as if afraid that letting me in too quickly would betray the father he had mourned beneath the oak tree. But the drawing remained, tacked to the wall of the barn, where I could see it each night, a promise more powerful than any medal I had ever been given, because it meant that in his heart there was now room for me to begin again. And so each day became a quiet test, not of strength or endurance as in the war, but of patience, humility, and faith. For I had learned that a man does not reclaim his family by simply coming back from the dead. He earns it one word, one gesture, one memory at a time. It was on a stormy night, the kind when rain lashes against the windows and the roof groans beneath the weight of wind, when I sat alone in the barn, surrounded by the sketches I had drawn and the silence that had become my only companion, that the door creaked open and Johnny stepped inside, his small figure outlined by the flickering lantern light, his hair plastered to his forehead from the dow, and poor, his shoulders squared with a determination that looked far too heavy for a boy of his years. He did not speak at first. He simply sat across from me at the table, his eyes darting from the scattered drawings to my face and back again, as if he were weighing something inside himself, and I could hear the rain hammering on the roof, could feel my own pulse pounding, as though I were back on the battlefield waiting for a command that might never come. Finally, in a voice both fragile and unyielding, he asked the question that had burned in his heart longer than I realized. "Why didn't you ever send me a letter?" Those words cut deeper than shrapnel, for they carried in them not only the longing of a child left fatherless, but also the accusation that I had chosen silence, that I had abandoned him not only in body, but in spirit. And though I wanted to protest, to tell him it was not my fault, I knew that excuses would not bridge the chasm between us. So I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the weight of memory, and began to tell him the truth. I told him how I had been captured after Bologna, how I had lain bleeding in a makeshift infirmary before being dragged to the camp near Trieste, how days and nights there bled into each other until time itself lost meaning, and how we clung to scraps of hope like drowning men grasping driftwood. I explained that letters were forbidden, that the few who tried saw their words burned or torn apart by guards who cared nothing for the lives we left behind, and that I had written one anyway, a single letter to him, pouring every ounce of my heart into it, though I knew it would never reach him. From the pocket of my worn jacket, I pulled out that letter, its paper yellowed, edges frayed, words smudged by sweat and rain, and I placed it in front of him with trembling hands. He looked at it as though it were a relic, something too fragile to touch, and then slowly he unfolded it and began to read. His lips moved silently as his eyes traced the faded lines, and I saw his face shift with every sentence. Confusion, sorrow, understanding, all the emotions of a boy meeting the voice of his father for the first time, not through memory, but through words written in a place of despair. When he finished, he sat very still, clutching the paper as though afraid it might vanish. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and then, without a word, he stood, stepped toward me, and threw his arms around my neck, holding me with a force that seemed to come not only from his small body, but from all the years of absence and grief. Through his sobs, I heard him whisper, "Now I believe you. Now I know you're my father." That embrace was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was not just the touch of a child, but the restoration of something that war had tried to erase. The return of a bond thought broken forever. And as I held him close, I felt for the first time since leaving for war that I was alive in truth, not merely surviving but living, because I had been recognized, accepted, forgiven. From that night forward, something fundamental shifted between us. Johnny no longer avoided me at the table, no longer looked away when I spoke, but instead began to ask questions, small at first. What was it like in the camp? Did I remember the dog we once had? How did I meet his mother? And in those questions I heard not only curiosity, but an opening, an invitation to step back into his life. And I answered each one with honesty, never hiding the pain, but never letting it smother the hope. I realized then that love, once lost, cannot simply be reclaimed by blood or by name. It must be rebuilt brick by brick, moment by moment, and that the foundation of our new life together was not the past I had missed, but the future we might still share. And those scars remained, his, mine, Margaret's. I finally believed that those scars did not have to be walls, but could be the very seams that bound us closer. That night, in the barn with rain drumming above and the smell of wet earth seeping through the cracks, I came back not as a soldier, not as a man returned from the dead, but as a father. And from that moment on, every day with my son was no longer borrowed time. It was life given back. Today, when I look at Johnny, no longer the frightened little boy who once called me a stranger, but a grown man with lines of wisdom on his face and the steady voice of a teacher, I realized that my return, with all its pain, rejection, and slow rebuilding, was not only about reclaiming a place in my family, but about ensuring that my story would live on beyond me, that the years of silence, the years of despair, the memories of hunger and barbed wire would not vanish when I did, but would instead become part of a lesson passed from father to son, from son to students, from memory to history. In his classroom, he keeps a photograph of the two of us together, taken not long after the night in the barn, when he finally embraced me as his father. And beside that photograph he has placed flowers, brought by children who know him not only as a teacher of dates and battles, but as a man whose own life was shaped by war's cruelty and by the long shadow of loss. And when I see that frame through the window as I walk past the school, when I hear the voices of children reciting words that carry my story within them, I feel a sense of peace that I never thought I would know, because it means that my suffering was not for nothing, that even the years stolen from me found their place in the world. Margaret remained by my side until the end of her days, and though we never fully bridged the silence that the telegram had placed between us, though there was always in her eyes the memory of the man she had buried under the oak tree, she loved me with a kind of quiet resilience, and I loved her with the gratitude of one who knows that even love altered by grief is still love worth holding. She was the strength that kept our home standing when I was gone, and without her, there would have been nothing for me to return to. What I came to understand in the long years after was that war had tried to erase me, had stripped me of my name, my role, my identity, but it could not take away the possibility of return, and that possibility, however fragile, was enough to keep me alive when I had every reason to give up. And when I finally did return, I learned that survival is not the same as living, that to truly live again required more than breathing, more than walking back through a door. It required forgiveness, patience, and above all, the courage to love again. Even when love seemed impossible, Johnny taught me that. He taught me that love can be lost and found again, that memory can fade but still be rekindled, and that sometimes all it takes to bridge the unbridgeable is a single question. Why didn't you send me a letter? And the courage to answer it with the truth. From that truth grew a bond stronger than the one we had before, because it was forged not only in blood, but in fire, in absence, in sorrow, and in the miracle of return. I was declared dead, but I came back, and slowly, patiently, painfully, my son learned to call me father again. And in that simple word, spoken after years of silence, I found the victory that no battlefield could ever give me. We share new stories every day, true stories that touch, inspire, and remind us of what it means to endure. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel to stay with us for the journeys still to come.